No hemos salido completamente de la crisis provocada por la pandemia internacional, y estamos viviendo una nueva crisis con la invasión de Rusia a Ucrania. ¿Qué nos dicen estas crisis? ¿Cómo confrontar estas crisis? ¿Cómo entender este momento histórico? Yo quiero agradecer la presencia en este programa de un escritor que admiro mucho, Ian Bremmer. Él es politólogo y ensayista estadounidense. Su principal interés de trabajo es los problemas políticos globales. Es fundador y presidente de Eurasia Group, una empresa de investigación y consultoría de riesgos políticos. Pronto se va a publicar un nuevo libro de él que se llama The Power of Crisis, El Poder de la Crisis. Mr. Bremmer, thank you very much for speaking with us. We seem to be going from crisis to crisis. We haven't finished the pandemic, and we're already seeing an invasion of Russia, of the Ukrainian territory. What are the lessons that we can learn? Can we ever escape from crisis, or how can we use crisis to actually improve our lives?
Yeah, it's the latter point. You can't, and I'm happy to be with you.
Thank you
for having me. You can't escape crisis, but you need to take advantage of crisis, especially when your governments, when your institutions, when your global architecture is not working the way it should. Very hard to suddenly make those changes unless you feel urgency. And we've seen a number of crises now that are creating urgency. Some, like the pandemic, that frankly weren't big enough in many ways to get global leaders to change their business as usual. But this attack by Russia into Ukraine, it's a very different story. I'm sure you've seen what's coming out of Europe right now. I mean, the German government going to be spending 2% minimum on GDP on defense going forward. Extraordinary unity coming from the EU and the United Kingdom, despite Brexit, and the United States. People were saying that the NATO alliance was increasingly rudderless, it didn't have a mission, didn't have a purpose. Vladimir Putin changed that. And now you have an extremely strong and cohesive NATO that absolutely knows why it exists. And so I do think that there's been an effort to take advantage of the crisis that we're seeing today in Ukraine. Of course, we can't forget that comes at the expense of the lives of thousands and thousands of Ukrainian citizens, potentially the existence of an independent Ukraine, democratic Ukraine, and indeed at the loss of our peace dividend. You know that when the Cold War was over and the Soviet Union collapsed, we said that there was a peace dividend for Europe and the rest of the world because we wouldn't have to fight each other, wouldn't have to spend so much money on defense, wouldn't have to focus on national security. That is over. And so the cost of this crisis is also something we're going to be living with for quite some time.
Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has claimed that he's had to invade Ukraine in order to preserve the safety of Russia. Has he miscalculated? Because everything seems to indicate that whatever happens with this war, it will not have an optimal outcome for Russia. Did he miscalculate?
Yeah, he clearly miscalculated, but the West helped him miscalculate, let's be clear. I mean, if you're Russian President Putin and you've been in power for a long time, you saw that when the Russians took a piece of Georgia back in 2008, there wasn't much response from the West, the international community. Then they took two pieces of Ukraine in 2014, not much response as a consequence. 2016, they intervened in the American election. Obama administration didn't do very much. Trump didn't care about it afterwards. And then now he says, well, 2022, I'm upset about NATO doing more with Ukraine. They're not listening to me. They refuse to accept what I consider red lines. So I'm going to go in. I think Putin had lots of reasons to believe, both in terms of the history of Western response to Russian provocation, as well as the more immediate history of Biden's losses in Afghanistan, his perceived weakness, his desire to focus on China, Merkel leaving the stage in Germany, Olaf Scholz with a weaker three-party coalition government that was less interested in a hard line on Russia as a consequence, Macron after the AUKUS debacle with the United States wanting strategic autonomy. Putin had many reasons to believe that this was going to go better for him. And you're right, it's been horrible for Putin. His economy is being destroyed. Europe has become much stronger. The Baltics will now probably have permanent NATO deployments. We'll see forward deployments in all of the NATO states that are on the Russian border, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania. And we're also seeing crippling sanctions being placed against Russia that will be in many ways permanent. I mean, the Europeans will no longer be willing to be reliant on Russia for their energy. They'll do everything possible to decouple, as well as the ability of oligarchs to do business on the European continent or in the UK. These are really significant moves that Putin can't be happy about, and they do reflect a fundamental miscalculation in his decision to invade.
But can Europe really decouple from energy coming from Russia? We saw that Angela Merkel actually decommissioned nuclear plants in Germany. Now it seems like a terrible mistake. Can actually Europe become self-reliant on gas and oil from other sources, or from Europe or from other sources, not from Russia?
So 3 answers to that question. Number 1 is there's a reason why the SWIFT ban for Russia has exceptions, and that includes the ability to pay for gas and oil that's distributed to Europe. So as it stands right now, despite the sanctions, if the Russians are willing to continue to provide export of oil and gas, the Europeans will take it. They'll continue to pay for it, despite the war footing that everybody is on right now. So they understand this problem. The Russians, of course, may not be willing to provide reliable oil and gas, even though they need the money. And of course, there's also the vulnerability of a lot of these pipelines that transit Ukraine, where we have a serious war going on right now. Number 2, in the near term, if that energy is cut off, this is going to be massively costly for the Europeans. There will have to be rationing on the part of the German citizens in particular, not the French, who are mostly reliant on nuclear, but many other European economies. This will be an enormous hit. It'll be very unpopular. It'll cause a lot of challenges for many of these leaders, including first and foremost Olaf Scholz. They can get some support from the US for LNG. They can get some support certainly from the Japanese, from the Qataris, from the Azeris, but it won't be enough if the energy is stopped. But within 3 years, there's no question the Europeans will be able to make very significant hedging away from Russian transited energy, Russian supplied energy. And part of that is alternate sources of natural gas, but a big part of it is the move towards renewables. You may know that the German government is planning to be 80% of its electricity delivered by renewables by 2030. They have the ability to do that. And that's extraordinary for the 4th largest economy, not a services economy, an industrial economy. So it is true that even if Putin hadn't invaded Ukraine, his energy leverage over Europe was already at its maximum. It was going to decrease significantly because of the move away from fossil fuels. That's now going to happen a lot faster across the European continent. They will do this.
There were 2 major superpowers during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States, but now there is a third power, China. How does it enter into all of these calculations? What's going to happen with China, and what do you see of the positions, ambivalent positions, that China has taken up to this point?
Well, Russia is only a military superpower. Their economy is the size of Texas, and it's heading towards the size of Tennessee, given what's happened in the last week. So it's not an economic superpower at all. China is not a military superpower, but they are an economic superpower. They're a technological superpower. And there are 2 different things happening with China right now. On the one hand, the Russians are going to be much more dependent on them, because if you can't sell your energy to Europe, you got to sell it to China. If you are getting excluded from buying your chips and other critical technologies for your military industrial complex from Europe, you got to buy them from China. So, I mean, the financial transactions, the Russians are being cut off from SWIFT. They're going to have to move to the Chinese version of SWIFT. So they're going to be much more reliant and the junior partner of Beijing going forward. But as you asked me, and as you've seen, the Chinese government is deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a second Cold War. They don't want to fight with the Europeans that's being pushed by the Russians right now, because the Europeans need access to the global economy as a commercial power. They want to do business with everybody. I mean, some parts of the Chinese economy have been more closed recently, like in big tech, but some parts have been more open. Goldman Sachs just got their license to do business in China. They have a Cold War with the Americans, the Europeans. That's going away. So the Chinese have been saying publicly that they do not want a military invasion. They oppose it. They want a ceasefire. They want to help negotiate it if they need to. They recognize Ukrainian territorial integrity. They recognize Crimea as a part of Ukraine, not Russia. And they oppose the invasion. And they've been telling the Russians that. The Russians just haven't been willing to listen.
You've told us many times that we have to learn from crisis. What are the lessons that we can derive from the present crisis, from what's happening in the Ukraine?
Perhaps the biggest lesson is that the losers of globalization need to be addressed, or those problems will grow. We've seen this with the rise of populism in democracies all over the world. Why did we have Brexit? Why was Trump elected president? Why did you have Bolsonaro in Brazil? Because the losers of globalization were angry. A lot of money was being made, but it wasn't being redistributed. And so we saw growing inequality. They got mad. Well, that also happened to the Russians. They lost the Cold War, and we largely didn't care. You know, NATO expanded, and the EU expanded, and you integrated those countries. They became wealthier, they became democratic, but the Russians were left behind. There was no Marshall Plan for Russia. The NATO-Russia Council, the Joint Council, was a big nothing burger. That we talked about, you know, sort of the idea of working closely with the Russians, but then the Americans did everything they could to diversify energy sources so that there could be more control coming out of pipelines that would cross the Caspian. You remember Baku-Jehan, which undermined Russian power. Well, I mean, you know, several decades later, it turns out that Putin's really angry about that. And he holds a grudge. He blames the West. And he still has all those nukes. They didn't get rid of them. They're still there. So Russia has an economy in free fall that the Americans and the Europeans are now doing everything they can to further collapse. But the Russians actually have the one military in the world, along with the United States, that can destroy the planet. And as you've seen over the last week, President Putin, former President Medvedev, Foreign Minister Lavrov, they've all been talking about the fact that if the Russians continue to get pushed by the West, this war will not just be in Ukraine. This war will expand. They're threatening, brandishing their nuclear deterrent on high alert. They're talking about the fact that there would be military consequences if Finland or Sweden, independent countries, decide they wanted to become members of NATO. They're threatening France, which is putting an economic war on Russia. They say, don't talk about economic war, you could lead to a real war. I mean, these are all very serious things. And, you know, you want to say, oh, they're just bluffing, they're not really going to do it. But of course, that's what everyone was saying about a full-scale Russian invasion into Ukraine 2 weeks ago. And look where we are now. I think we need to take these things very seriously.
Can we really think that the nuclear threat by Russia is real? Can Russia really use nuclear weapons in this war or maybe later?
They have 5,000 nuclear warheads. You know, in 1962, I wasn't alive, but we had a Cuban Missile Crisis. Seems insane to look back on the idea that the world was this close to blowing itself up with nuclear weapons. And we ended up resolving the crisis in part by secretly giving the former General Secretary Khrushchev, promising him that the Jupiter missiles that were located, stationed in Turkey, nuclear missiles that could hit the Soviet Union, would be removed in return for the climb down of the Cuban missiles that the Soviets had lied about. Could that happen with the Russians today? Absolutely, it could happen. I mean, if Putin believes that he's going to lose power, if Putin believes that his economy is falling apart because of the West, if he believes that he's going to lose the war in Ukraine because of support coming from the West, I mean, it's absolutely possible that you could see an escalation. And I'm not just saying the Russians say we're going to use nukes, then they use nukes. I'm saying this could become a conflict with NATO. I mean, what happens when Zelensky is removed from power and there's an exile government in France or in Poland, and the West is still providing weapons to partisans on the ground? Those weapons are coming through Poland. They're killing Russians and killing Ukrainian citizens under Russian rule at that point. What happens if the Russians start attacking some of those bases providing those weapons? What if they follow some of those partisans across the border into Poland, for example. I mean, you can so easily see situations where this present conflict suddenly is involving NATO states. And if the Russians attack a NATO state, well, all of the NATO allies are committing to defend the NATO state. Now, that's not nuclear, that can be military confrontation, but that's military confrontation between NATO and Russia. And ultimately, Russia will lose that fight unless they're willing to brandish their nuclear deterrent. So again, I'm not telling you that nuclear war is coming. I'm telling you that nuclear confrontation, which was unthinkable for the last 30 years, is now possible. And therefore, it must be thinkable. And therefore, we have to do whatever we can to manage it. We can't just be saying, how do we punish the Russians? How do we pile on the Russians? Because if that's all we do, and we don't think about managing escalation in the crisis, we are more likely to have an outcome that none of us want.
Ian Bremmer, thank you for helping us to understand the power of this crisis. Y a usted, amigo televidente, que hace posible este programa, se lo agradezco también. Esto es todo por hoy, pero no se lo olvide. Nos vemos la próxima.